This is the story of a family that looked perfect on the outside, but behind the smiles, behind the Facebook posts, lay a darkness no one saw coming. Meet Shanann Watts, a mother, a wife, a friend. She was bubbly, energetic, and lived much of her life out loud on social media. On Facebook, Shanann painted a picture of joy. She posted videos of her two little girls, Bella and Celeste, giggling, dancing, calling out for daddy. She often shared how grateful she was for her husband, Chris. In one post, she wrote, "Chris, you're the best dad, the best husband. We are so blessed." And everyone believed it. Why wouldn't they? Shanann worked hard as a Thrive health promoter, building her business from home. Her online presence showed not only her success, but also her determination. She battled lupus, an autoimmune disease, but she never let it slow her down. Her friends admired her. Her family adored her. And Chris was the quiet one. He didn't post much. He wasn't loud or flashy. He was soft-spoken, reserved, the type who blended into the background. But that contrast, her energy and his quietness, seemed to work. At least, that's how it looked from the outside. Behind closed doors, however, the cracks were starting to show. Shanann would later confide in friends that Chris wasn't as affectionate as before. The man she once called her rock was slipping away, and she was pregnant again, a baby boy whom they had already named Nico. For Shanann, this pregnancy was supposed to bring the family closer. But for Chris, it would trigger something far darker. Because while Shanann was sharing videos of her daughters laughing and singing online, Chris was quietly drifting into another world. A world of secrets, a world of betrayal. And what he would do next would shock the entire nation. But before we get there, let's go back to the night. Shanann returned from her business trip when everything began to unravel. Don't go anywhere. Part 2. The morning of suspicion. When Shanann didn't show up for her doctor's appointment the next morning, her best friend Nicole immediately grew concerned. Nicole had dropped Shanann off at 2 a.m. after a late business trip. She knew Shanann was pregnant, tired, and had two little girls to care for. So when Shanann didn't text or call back, Nicole felt something was very wrong. She drove to Shanann's house around 12 p.m. that same day. The moment she pulled up, unease set in. Shanann's car was still in the driveway. Inside the car were the girls' car seats, untouched. Nicole rang the doorbell. No answer. She tried calling. Still nothing. This isn't like her. Nicole muttered under her breath. Worry growing, she called Shanann's husband, Chris Watts, who was supposedly at work. Chris brushed off her concern, telling her Shanann was probably out with the kids. But Nicole wasn't buying it. She knew her friend too well. Finally, desperate, Nicole called the police for a welfare check. When officers arrived, what they found only deepened the mystery. Inside the house, Shanann's purse, phone, and medication were all there. Her shoes were by the door. The car seats were still in the vehicle. And yet, Shanann and her two daughters were nowhere to be found. It looked as if they had simply vanished into thin air. But Nicole knew mothers don't just vanish without their car, their phone, and their children's essentials. Something was wrong, very, very wrong. And that was the exact moment the Watts family story spiraled from a simple missing persons case into one of the darkest, most disturbing crimes America has ever witnessed. But what happened next would shock even seasoned investigators. And as we peel back the layers, you'll see why this case gripped the entire nation. Stay with me, because the truth was just beginning to unravel. Part 3. Chris's strange behavior. When police entered the Watts home with Nicole by their side, their body cameras captured everything. At first glance, the house looked normal, too normal. Shanann's shoes were neatly by the door. Her purse was in plain sight. Her wedding ring was on the nightstand. The phone she used constantly left charging on the couch. Every clue screamed the same thing. Shanann hadn't planned on going anywhere. And then Chris arrived. The cameras caught his entrance, cool, calm, and almost rehearsed. Instead of the panic you might expect from a husband whose wife and daughters had suddenly disappeared, Chris acted strangely casual. He walked around the house, pointing things out to officers. He showed them the bedrooms. He even mentioned that Shanann might have gone to a friend's house. But here's what struck investigators. Chris never once called out for his wife. He didn't shout their names. He didn't frantically check closets or bathrooms. Instead, he seemed more concerned with explaining himself than actually finding his family. And the neighbors noticed too. One man across the street showed police his security footage, which captured Chris backing his truck into the driveway early that morning, something he had never done before. As they all stood watching the footage together, the neighbor whispered to officers off camera, "He's not acting right. Something's off with him." That moment set off alarms in the minds of investigators. It wasn't just that Shanann and the girls were missing. It was that Chris Watts, the man who should have been the most desperate to find them, was acting like a man with something to hide. And over the next 48 hours, the mask Chris wore would begin to slip. But before we go deeper, let me ask you, do you think Chris already knew what had happened at this point? Or was he still trying to figure out how to cover his tracks? Drop your thoughts below. And if you haven't yet, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because what happens in the next chapter of this case will leave you speechless. Part 4. The Polygraph Trap. When Shanann and the girls had been missing for more than a day, the case shifted from a welfare check to a potential crime. And Chris Watts was now the focus. He did interviews. He stood outside his home, looking straight into news cameras, and pleaded for his family's return. "Shanann, Bella, Celeste, if you're out there, just come back. The house isn't the same without you." But to the trained ear, something didn't sound right. His words lacked emotion. His eyes darted. His body language was cold. The public began to whisper, was Chris really a grieving husband, or was he hiding the truth? Detectives moved quickly. They invited Chris to the station, not for one interview, but several. And each time he seemed more robotic. So investigators pulled out their most powerful weapon, the polygraph test. Now, most people panic at the idea of taking a lie detector, but Chris, he agreed instantly, almost like he thought he could beat it. He sat in the chair, wires strapped to his chest, fingers hooked to sensors, and the examiner leaned in and asked, "Did you physically harm Shanann? Did you do anything to cause the disappearance of your daughters?" Chris calmly answered, "No." But the polygraph told a different story. He failed, miserably. And here's the shocking part. Instead of hiding the results, the examiner leaned forward and said, "Chris, you're lying, and this is the worst decision of your life." For the first time since this nightmare began, Chris's composure cracked. He shifted in his chair. His breathing grew heavy. He asked for his father, who was waiting nearby. And in a private room with his father beside him, Chris began to confess. But his words were not the truth. Not yet. He told his dad that he killed Shanann, but only because she had strangled the children first. A desperate, twisted lie to shield himself. And detectives knew it. But what they didn't know yet was how far Chris had already gone to cover his tracks. And in the next chapter, you'll see just how dark his plan truly was. Don't go anywhere. This is where the story turns from shocking to horrifying. Part 5. The Cracks in Chris's Lies. When Chris Watts finally sat across from his father Ronnie in that small interrogation room, his calm mask began to break. His voice cracked. His hands shook. And then he dropped what he thought was a safe version of the truth. He told his father that Shanann had strangled the girls, that in a blind, uncontrollable rage, he had killed Shanann. But detectives, watching from the other side of the glass, knew this was just another desperate lie. The evidence told a very different story. First, there was the neighbor's surveillance camera showing Chris backing his truck into the driveway in the early morning hours, loading something large again and again. Second, Shanann's body had been found exactly where Chris's coworker said he had been that morning, at an oil site. And third, the girls' bodies, heartbreakingly, had been hidden inside the oil tanks themselves. No mother could have done that to her children. The story Chris told his father simply didn't add up. So, detectives confronted him again. This time, no more sympathy, no more patience. They laid it all out. The affair with Nicole Kessinger, the mounting financial pressures, and the reality that his picture-perfect family life was cracking apart. Chris's motive was staring them all in the face. It wasn't a moment of blind rage. It was a calculated choice to start over without his wife and children in the way. When detectives pressed harder, Chris finally admitted he had killed Shanann, but even then, he wouldn't say the full truth about his daughters. He mumbled, he avoided eye contact, and he tried, one last time, to make himself seem like the victim. But the evidence was undeniable. Chris Watts had murdered his pregnant wife Shanann and their two little girls, Bella and Celeste. And soon, the world would learn the shocking details of how he tried to cover it up. But before we get into the chilling courtroom drama, the sentencing, and the haunting last words spoken in court, make sure you're subscribed, because what comes next will leave you speechless. Part 6. The Courtroom Truth. By the time Chris Watts stood before the court, the entire country was watching. The smiling family man, once posing in happy photos with Shanann and their daughters, was now revealed as a cold-blooded killer. The prosecution laid out the horrifying details in a voice that was steady but heavy with grief. Shanann, 15 weeks pregnant, strangled in her own bed. Bella and Celeste, smothered by the very hands that were supposed to protect them. Their tiny bodies dumped in oil tanks, left to decay in the dark. And all of this, for what? So Chris could chase a new life with his mistress. The courtroom was filled with sobs. Shanann's family sat clutching one another, broken but determined to hear every word. When it came time for the defense, Chris didn't even try to fight. His lawyers announced he would plead guilty to avoid the death penalty. It was the only mercy he would ever be granted. Then came the sentencing hearing, and Shanann's family finally had the chance to speak. Her brother's voice trembled with anger and pain. He called Chris a coward, a man who destroyed 4 lives without hesitation. Her father, Frank Razuchek, looked directly at Chris. His voice cracked as he said, "You carried them out like trash, but they were pure, and they trusted you." The room fell silent, except for quiet sobs. And then the most powerful moment came. Shanann's mother, Sandy, stood tall, tears in her eyes. She looked at the man who had murdered her daughter and grandchildren, and she said, "I forgive you, because that's what Shanann would have wanted. But you will live with this truth forever." Even Chris lowered his head. The judge delivered the sentence swiftly. 5 life sentences without the possibility of parole. Chris Watts would die in prison. The courtroom exhaled. Justice had spoken. But the story didn't end there. In prison, Chris eventually admitted the full horrifying truth. He had first killed Shanann. Then, one by one, his little girls. And the most chilling detail? Bella, the oldest, had fought back. She had screamed, "Daddy, no," before her small body gave out. That detail will haunt the world forever. Shanann's memory, however, lives on. Her family has dedicated their lives to honoring her, Bella, Cece, and the unborn baby they had named Nico. They spread awareness about domestic violence, about the hidden dangers behind fake smiles, and about trusting your instincts when something feels wrong. And through Shanann's old videos, her Facebook Lives, her posts filled with love and joy, people around the world continue to see her for who she really was. A woman who loved deeply, a mother who gave her all, and a family who deserved so much better. This is the true story of Chris Watts, the man who betrayed his family in the most unforgivable way. If you made it this far, thank you for keeping Shanann's story alive. And if you never want to miss another true crime deep dive, hit subscribe, because next time we'll unravel another case that shook the world. Until then, hold your loved ones close.